The rule is this: a wife does not refuse her husband. Not ever. Not for any reason. Not when she is exhausted or unwell or frightened or confused or in pain she cannot name. Not when she does not understand what is being asked of her. Not when something in her body is saying no in a language that has no words because no one ever gave her the words for it. The rule is not written down anywhere I know of. It is not posted on a wall or recited in a ceremony or handed to a girl on her wedding day in the form of a document. It is older than documents. It was present in the community I grew up in the way gravity is present. Not announced, not explained, simply operating. A force you do not question because it has never occurred to anyone that questioning is available. I followed this rule for the first 3 years of my marriage. I am telling you this not because I want your sympathy. I am telling you this because of the second part of the rule, the part that cost more than the rule itself. The second part is, no one is allowed to question it. My name is Rebecca. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio, and I left the community 5 years ago. This channel, Beyond the Bonnet, is where I ask, out loud, the questions I was not allowed to ask for 17 years. Subscribe and give this video a like if you want honest, unfiltered stories from behind the bonnet. 2 seconds of your time. It matters more than I can explain. And I want to make you a specific promise before we go any further. By the end of this video, I am going to say out loud, clearly in plain English, for the first time in my life, the question I was never allowed to ask about that rule. The question that, had I asked it at 17, would have changed everything that came after. I have been building to this question for 5 years, and I am going to ask it here, on this channel, in front of whoever is watching. But first I need to tell you where the rule comes from, because the rule did not begin with my community, and it does not end there either. And understanding where it began is the only way to understand what it cost every woman who followed it without knowing she could ask. Leave me a comment before you go. Was there ever a rule in your life, not just a spoken one, but an unspoken one, the kind woven into the walls of the world you grew up in, that you followed for years before it occurred to you to ask why? I will read every answer. Now, the rule. The rule that a wife does not refuse her husband is not an Amish invention. I want to say that plainly because it matters. The Amish community I grew up in did not create this rule. They received it. From scripture as they interpreted it, from tradition as it had calcified over centuries, from the particular theology of submission and order that runs through Old Order Amish life like a structural beam. But the beam was already there when they built around it. They inherited a rule that is thousands of years old, embedded in interpretations of Paul's letters, encoded in the concept of the wife's body as belonging to her husband, ratified by centuries of religious and civil law that have only recently and only partially been revised. Here is what that inheritance means practically. Every woman who received this rule in my community received it from a woman who had received it from a woman who had received it from a woman, back through generations so many that the origin has become invisible. The rule does not arrive as a rule. It arrives as the shape of things, as the way marriage is, as the water you swim in, and you do not question the water because the water is everywhere, and you have always been in it, and there is no shore you can see from where you are. And here is the part that matters most, the part that explains why the prohibition on questioning is the cruelest element of all. The rule survives because it prevents its own examination. The prohibition on questioning is not separate from the rule. It is the rule's immune system. Every community that holds this rule also holds, implicitly, the understanding that a woman who questions it is a woman who does not trust God. A woman who does not trust her husband. A woman who does not understand her place. A woman who has been listening to the wrong voices. The question is not merely discouraged. The question is framed as a spiritual failure. And in a community where spiritual failure is the deepest form of shame, where faith is not private but communal, witnessed, performed in front of 300 people every Sunday, the cost of asking is not just social. It is existential. It is the cost of being the woman who questioned what God designed. So no one asks, and the rule continues. And every generation of women hands it forward to the next, intact and unexamined, because the examination itself has been designated a sin. I want to tell you about the first year of my marriage. Samuel, the name I use for my husband here, was not a cruel man. I have said this before on this channel, and I will keep saying it because it is true, and because the truth of it is important to the story. He was not demanding. He was not aggressive. He was, by the standards of the community we both grew up in, a good husband. Steady, present, faithful, hard-working, gentle in his way. He also had the rule. Not as a demand he made, not as a thing he said out loud or held over me. He had it the way I had it, absorbed through the water, carried in the bones, present in his understanding of what a marriage was and what a wife was, and what the word yield in that long wedding sermon actually meant in practice. He did not know I was afraid sometimes. I did not tell him. He did not know that there were nights when something in my body was quiet and still in a way that felt like it was saying something. Not with words. I didn't have words for it. But with a kind of stillness that, if I had had the language, I might have called no. He did not know because I didn't know. I didn't know that the stillness was information. I didn't know that information was allowed. The rule had taught me that my body's responses were not data to be read. They were flesh to be subdued. And so I subdued them. I got up in the mornings and started the fire and put the kettle on and moved through my days with the particular steadiness of a woman who has organized herself around a shape she did not choose and has made that shape her discipline. I cooked and cleaned and worked and attended church and sat on the hard benches and listened to the same sermons about yielding and felt, on the good days, a genuine peace, and on the other days, a silence that I called peace because I had no other name for it. 3 years. 3 years of following a rule I had never been told was a rule because it had never needed to be told because it was simply the shape of things. And then something happened that I did not expect. I asked a question. Not a full question. Not a clean, clear, articulate question with a subject and a verb and a direct object. Just the beginning of one. A half-formed thing that came out of my mouth one evening when Samuel and I were sitting after supper, in the particular quietness of two people who have learned each other's silences, and I said, "Can I say no?" Just that. 3 words. He looked at me. I don't know what I expected. I had not planned to ask. It had come out of some place I hadn't known was waiting to speak, and now it was in the room and I couldn't take it back, and I sat there looking at my hands. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know." Not unkindly. Honestly. He genuinely didn't know. No one had told him either. The rule had been in the water for him the same way it had been in the water for me, and he had swum in it without thinking about the shore. And here we both were, suddenly aware that there might be a shore, neither of us with any idea what was on it. "I don't know," he said, and then, "I think that's a question for the bishop." He meant it as a resolution. He meant, this is something larger than us, something theological, something that has an answer we simply haven't been taught yet. Let's find someone who knows. I nodded. I said, "Okay." We did not go to the bishop, and we never spoke about it again. But the question had been in the room, and it didn't leave. What happened after I asked that question was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no revelation. No one came and answered it. What happened was smaller and more important than that. I started noticing things. I noticed that the rule was never discussed in any sermon I could remember. It was embedded in the language of the sermons, in yield, in submit, in a wife's body is not her own, but never named directly, never examined, never held up to the light. I noticed that when I looked at the older women around me, the women who had been married for 20 and 30 years, there was something in their faces that I had always read as contentment and now began to read differently. Not all of them, not always, But sometimes, in certain lights, at certain moments, there was something that looked less like peace and more like the very careful management of an interior life that had learned, over decades, to take up as little space as possible. I noticed that no younger woman I knew had ever asked the question I had asked. Or if they had asked it inward, never outward, never in a room where it could be heard. And I noticed something about myself that was harder to name, that the asking had changed something. Not in my marriage, not immediately, not in any way I could point to, but in me. Something had shifted in the week after the evening I said those 3 words. Something about the silence I had been calling peace. It no longer felt the same. Because I had learned, by the simple act of saying 3 words out loud, that the question was possible. That it fit in a human mouth. That it could exist in a room and not bring the ceiling down. The ceiling had not come down. The rule was still there. But I now knew that the rule could be addressed, that it was not gravity. That gravity, if you are sufficiently motivated and sufficiently airborne, can be escaped. That knowledge is the beginning of everything. I want to give you something before Dr. Elaine. A piece of context that I found years after I left, in a book I read in an English library on a Tuesday afternoon when I had nowhere to be and no one watching. The concept of marital duty, the theological and legal doctrine that a wife's body belongs to her husband, has a specific name in legal history. It is called the doctrine of marital exemption. For most of Western legal history, this doctrine meant that what happened between a husband and wife in their bedroom was not subject to law at all. The wife had, by the act of marriage, given permanent and irrevocable consent. There was no mechanism for withdrawal, no language that permitted it, no court that would hear it. This doctrine was not overturned in the United States until 1993. 1993. 33 years ago. And in many religious communities, including, in practice if not in stated theology, the one I grew up in, the doctrine did not change with the law. Because the doctrine had never been law to them. It had been scripture. And scripture does not update with legislation. I sat in that library for a long time after I read that. Not because it shocked me, because it didn't. It named something I had already known in my body. It gave historical weight to a thing I had been carrying without knowing its name. When I brought this to Dr. Elaine, the library, the book, the doctrine, she said something I want to give you the same way she gave it to me. She said, "Notice that the doctrine required the prohibition on questioning to survive. It wasn't enough to have the rule. The rule had to be protected from examination. And the most effective protection was theological. If questioning the rule means questioning God, then the only women who question it are women who have already failed spiritually. You preemptively disqualify the questioner. You don't have to answer the question if the question itself is evidence of the asker's unworthiness." She let that sit. Then, "You asked anyway. At your kitchen table, 3 years in, with no theological training and no external permission and no idea what the answer would be. You asked with 3 words. That was not a small thing. That was, in the framework you grew up in, an act of extraordinary courage, even if no one told you so, even if you didn't know it yourself." I had not thought of it that way. 3 words, 3 years in, at a kitchen table. Extraordinary courage. I am still learning to hold that. The rule does not protect marriage. I want to say this as precisely as I can because the rule is always framed as protection of the marriage, of the family structure, of the husband's authority as given by God, of the community's order. What the rule actually protects is the rule. A marriage in which one person cannot say no is not a marriage. It is a contract with one signature and one set of obligations and one party with the power to define the terms. The language of marriage, love, partnership, mutual respect, the union of 2 people who choose each other, requires that both people are capable of choosing yes, and therefore of choosing no. A yes that cannot become a no is not a yes. It is compliance, and compliance, maintained over years and decades in the most intimate territory of a person's life, does something specific to a person. It teaches them that their interior life is not information, that what their body knows and what their mind feels and what some quiet part of them is trying to say is not data to be read. It is flesh to be subdued. I spent 3 years being subdued. I am spending the rest of my life being unsubdued. The rule does not protect the woman. The prohibition on questioning does not protect the woman. The framing of the question as spiritual failure does not protect the woman. All of it protects the rule. And the rule is not God. There are things the community I grew up in gave me that I hold without ambivalence. The understanding that a life lived alongside other people, genuinely alongside them, in their kitchens and their fields and their grief and their celebrations, is a different quality of life than one lived in the particular modern isolation I have seen since I left. The texture of belonging. The specific satisfaction of work done with your hands, from before sunrise, for something that feeds someone you love. And I hold Samuel. Not our marriage exactly. We did not survive leaving together, and that is a long story for another video. But Samuel himself, the man who sat across from me at a kitchen table and heard 3 words and said, "I don't know, honestly," without defense, without anger, without using the rule as a weapon. He had the rule the same way I did. He swam in the same water. And when I named the shore, he looked at it with me rather than away from it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing that made leaving possible. Not the rule, but what happened when I questioned it, and what he did when I did. I hold that. I promised you a question, the one I spent 17 years not knowing I was allowed to ask. The one that had been sitting in my mouth since the first morning of my marriage, when something in my body went still, and I called the stillness peace because I had no other name for it. The one that came out 3 years later, in 3 words at a kitchen table, and changed something in me even though it changed nothing yet in my life. The question is not complicated. It is, in fact, the simplest question in the world. So simple that its absence, the 17 years I spent not knowing it could be asked, is the thing that takes explanation, not the question itself. The question is, what do I want? That is it. That is the question every Amish bride follows the rule without being allowed to ask. Not, is the rule right? Not, should I refuse? Not even, do I say no tonight? Just, what do I want? Not what does God want? Not what does my husband want? Not what does the community expect? Not what does the sermon require? What do I, Rebecca, in this body, on this night, in this marriage, want? I did not ask that question for 17 years because I had been raised in a world that had decided, long before I was born, that my wanting was not the point. That my wanting was, in fact, the problem. The flesh that needed subduing. The self that needed yielding. The voice that needed to be quieter than the rule. I am asking it now. Here. On this channel, out loud. And I want to ask you something in the comments. Not to tell me your story if you don't want to, not to expose yourself to strangers, but just this. Is there a rule in your life, not necessarily about marriage, not necessarily religious, that you have followed without being allowed to ask what you want? Just yes or no, or the whole story if you want to tell it. The room is here. The question is allowed. Subscribe to Beyond the Bonnet. Every video I make is the question I was not allowed to ask, finally being asked. We are nowhere near done. Until next time. What do you want? You are allowed to know. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.